Good evening. Call to order the City of Cedar Falls Planning and Zoning Commission meeting for Wednesday, April 11th, 2018. And Ms. Howard, if we could have the roll call, please.
Yes, Atkins? Here. Hartley?
Here.
Giroso?
Giroso, here.
Leeper?
Here.
Wingert?
Here.
Saul?
Here.
Overly?
Here.
Holst? Absent.
Thank you. Next, we'll move on to presentation of the minutes from our March 28th commission meeting. Are there any comments or corrections to those minutes? Seeing none, is there a motion to approve?
Move.
Is there a second? All those in favor of approval of those minutes signify with aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Nay? Thank you. Our minutes are approved. Move on at this point at general public comments and invite anyone interested in speaking to come up to the microphone. Please state your name and address for the record.
I will. I'll get this down. Is that good? Okay. Rosemary Beach, 5018 Sage Roads, Western Home Communities. And I am here, and Marty is not here, and I'm so sorry because I was going to use him for backup. You know that we've been through the gas station bit, and it in our area of community with the homes there, and with the neighborhood. And I am here just to give you a little push to look at your codes. And I think that all of this could have been handled so much better and taken advantage of what you knew and what the public didn't know, that we could have dealt with it in a better manner. I thought the neighborhood did a wonderful job of telling their story. I hope you all watched ours. I don't know, but it seems to me this started a year ago, if I'm correct, in P&Z. That it was a good year ago that we started talking about a gas station out there. And the neighborhood came and they gave all their reasons, and they couldn't happen. Now, I understand that P&Z has you have a code you have to work by. You have because I don't know, can I ex parte people on P&Z? I can't on the council anymore. Are you allowed to talk to people on P&Z either?
No.
That really is a stumbling block, isn't it? I have been known to go and have coffee with council members and look people in the eye and tell them what I thought they were doing that wasn't to the good of the community. And seemingly that's a lost art that we're working our way out of. But I can't fix that tonight, and you can't fix that. But in any event, were any of you on, oh, Marty is here. I am glad that he's here.
Welcome, Marty.
Are you the longest serving person on this council?
I am.
Okay, then I want to ask you this question. Do you remember when the big
Pop
signs
quiz.
appeared?
When
When the big signs appeared, the big billboards?
for
Cedar Falls. One day we discovered we had a great big sign down on First Street, and people wanted to come and put big billboards all up and down the road.
that's been a long time ago.
That's a long time ago. I remember sitting over there on the floor because this was so full of people who did not want big advertising signs all up and down the roads and in Cedar Falls, and suddenly there they were. And nobody seemed to remember that there was no reason they couldn't be here, and they just put them up. And I think, and that's what I hoping for you would remember, I think you
That's probably
just
15
said,
years
wait a
ago.
minute, we got to look at what we're doing. And you put it on hold. And you looked at what you could and couldn't do, and I don't know how many, again, years ago that was, but you said, just wait. We have to address this by changing our code and by looking at where we came from. And you did that. And we don't have, the big signs that we have, like down on, First and Franklin, we don't have those. And we don't have big billboards that go all the way up and down the highways. And people came in and talked about that had to do with when the highway work was done. And you put, I guess, a moratorium on them, and you looked at your code and you fixed it. So I think you probably still have the same code on what goes up on big billboards. And I wish that's what could have happened when we came to the gas station situation. Because it seems to me in Cedar Falls, we have no right for our people who build their houses, who are our citizens, and I do believe, and Susan said it was true, our citizens are our business. That's what this group says and the council says. They used to have it on stuff. And I don't think that they really paid attention to their citizens. They paid attention to what they thought was a rule, I guess, but it didn't do much for the people who live in the area. So that's why I'm here, is asking you to do that. And in doing that, this is some of the things that I have, these have been in the newspaper. If I didn't take the Courier, I probably wouldn't know that. There was in the call the Courier explaining ex parte. And it's the Planning and Zoning City Council and Zoning Commission relates only to land use matters. What else is there? What else do we vote on other than land use? Isn't land use a big amount of what you do? You say, well, you can use that piece of land for what if I come in, can I use that piece of land for what I want to use it for? And it's up to you people to follow whatever code you have and say, doesn't fit, does fit. So that was in that. So I don't know whatever else we come to P&Z for. Is there anything else? I don't know. And evidently, maybe you don't know either. I don't know if there's anything else. Okay. We had a big study, of course, they were all the talking on the Quick Start. A lot of it was the traffic out there. And the traffic is going to be really bad, and I say that, and I would have been in hopes that they would have thought ahead far enough that that corner is, I guess, if it's about 3:15, there's a lot of traffic coming out on South Main. And about 5:30, then there's another loop of whole big traffic. And yeah, it's not bad today, but that's not the answer to the long run. This was a Courier editorial, December of 17th. I don't know who wrote that one, but it was in the College Hill plan, and we were all working on that. And in the end of the article, it says, zoning ordinances are created presumably to accommodate the best interests of all involved. Perhaps zoning ordinance specific to this project need to be looked at more closely. So I think, I didn't write that. Somebody at the Courier did, but that's what I think. Okay, this one was the Courier, March 7th, from Waverly. And Casey's wants to rezone an area up there. And the minority siding with neighbors worried about increased traffic, safety, and declining property values. Doesn't that sound familiar? And one of the person who's talking here, and I won't mention his name, agreed. To me, this boils down to a question of property rights, this gentleman said. And these on the council there, or on the planning and zoning. He agreed the city's comprehensive use plan, as well as the construction of Cedar River Parkway, made it desirable to Casey's to want a convenience store and gas station. But he disagreed it trumped neighbors' property rights. Now they're talking about the same thing in Waverly, and I think that's interesting to me. Okay, then we had the plan reviewed, which I've been coming to council meetings off and on through lots of years. In fact, I even ran for council once about 40 years ago. And I really didn't know that you could vote on something and then take your vote back and vote again at a different time. So I thought that was interesting for our particular thing, which has nothing to do with P&Z. Okay, this is,
Ms. Beach,
I think, the register.
Ms. Beach, I think we're most interested in hearing from you as a citizen.
Well, but you see, I can tell you that, but I want you to realize that this same controversy is going on somewhere else, and they don't know how to stop it either. And that, yeah, I've been to every council meeting, I think for a year or so, and I've been here, and we still did not, as a neighborhood, get what we thought was important. So, all I can do is take people who are doing the same thing and see how they're trying to do it and what's going on. That we aren't an island and we didn't make it up. So I don't know, do I have 5 minutes? Am I over? I don't know whether you have 5-minute things or not. I'll read one more, okay? Just because this, I like this a lot. This is a register from Elma, Iowa, and this is on pig farms. And this gentleman says, we should have more control over what goes into our county. So right now, we have no control whatsoever. And that's what I'm getting at. We have no control whatsoever, seemingly, to what goes into our town. So, not that we put bad things in our town, and I don't think I've ever come and asked for anything bad for our town. But I have asked for common sense, I guess. I do, I'm sorry, I want to read one more, because this was in Sunday's paper, and this is from an editorial on the amendments. Long before the Revolutionary War, Benjamin Franklin proffered, without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom, and no such thing as public liberty without freedom of speech. So when you put ex parte in the middle of it, isn't that our freedom of speech to be able to talk to you people and be able to talk to our council? There's a couple of things going on I don't understand how we got there. And I'm asking you, as the representatives of this fine group, that you take a page from the past where we looked at the signs. You would have had, I don't remember what that company was, but I talked to that young man after he came out of the meeting one night, and I said, you're never going to get that through our city council. You're never going to get big signs here like that. We wouldn't let you. And they didn't. Now, I don't know how they did that. And I know I've heard people say, well, we'll be sued if we don't follow our rules. We'll be sued. We can't do that. Well, maybe it's worth that to stand up and say, you're not going to do that. But for you people to begin to talk to the council people, or those council people to talk to you, to say, and I think that I was told that the last time they were looked at was 2011. That's a long time, and I believe that you're beginning to work on re-looking at your basic code. But I just came to make sure you are.
Rosemary, there's a difference though between the billboards. I mean, that was actually a change in the ordinance as to what's allowed for billboards and what's not. I don't know that there's really anything you can change on the gas station because it's a zoning thing. So if it's zoned for that, you can't zone it so they can never have them. So
well,
so it becomes a question of the zoning, and that that discussion happened a long time ago as to what it was going to be zoned, and that's when that decision's got to be made.
And some of this is about people buying houses. Some of this is about people buying houses and not being aware of the zoning adjacent to them as
Right.
well.
Well, that's true. When we moved to Western Home, we were told it was small businesses. We were told that up front.
Well, I can tell you when that zoning was approved, I was on the commission, and there was discussion about whether that was going to be controversial or not, having the potential to have, a quick start there, and it was.
Oh, okay.
So that in that zoning, it was understood that that would be a possibility. It was discussed. The majority everybody was on the commission then. Everybody was on the city council then because it proceeded through. It had open meetings, and the majority decided that that was an appropriate zoning. So,
well, seemingly, it didn't get out to the neighborhood nor to me. So that's all I could say. Yeah. And when the gas station first started, Casey's came and went so fast I never did figure, and I was under the impression that was because of driveway or something, and they wouldn't give up a driveway. But I don't know where Casey's. Wasn't even kindly aware of it.
Well, then that went on for a number of meetings back then too, because that was pretty hotly contested on that.
But
You know,
dude,
there's
I don't
discrepancies
think
going
that
on there,
you-
so, you know, unless the city's gonna go door to door and notify everybody, I mean, there's limits to what they can do too. You know, it's,
Well, there's less limits because you can put it on a computer somewhere and you can send it out in emails. But when we started this round of things, I didn't get a letter about Quick Star, but my neighbor up on Rosemary got a letter about it. And so then it began to seep through Western Home that this was happening. But no, we weren't aware of it. And yes, maybe that's our problem, but I was told one thing and I believed that thing, and I don't want to spend my life coming to meetings just so I make sure I don't miss a thing. So I'm just asking for you to look at what you're doing. Churches next door would be fine. We accepted a grocery store. Now, you know, and one of the comments was I was okay with it when I discovered all the housing was on the north side and all the business was on the south side. What do they think Western Home is? It's 1,000 people out there. We're not business. Well, we are business, kind of, sort of, but we aren't a shopping center. And when you have a shopping center a quarter of a mile away with a gas station in it, to me, it's common sense says you don't need one a quarter mile up the road in what we consider a housing area and a neighborhood. We are a neighborhood. That includes all the houses that built down below who thought they were okay, and all the houses, even if you're on the south side or on the north side, they're going to get most of the light and the traffic. I'm not going to get it. I am in this lovely little space called Sage Road, and I don't even get local traffic because we're enclosed. It's not because I want to be here. It's because I think it is for the good of the community. And all I'm asking is you look at what could happen out there to make life easier, and remember that we are your business. And I don't know, it's just one of the other things I had the other night was we did a customer service survey in Tourism Bureau. And one of the things that was on there was, what feelings will visitors associate with their time in Cedar Falls and Waterloo? And this is what was put on there. I didn't put it on there. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I really think, you know, nobody was naughty to all of those people. They came and they said what was important to them, and I feel that they were not taken very seriously for what they wanted for their neighborhood. The end. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary.
The ex parte communication piece has come up a number of times, and I'm wondering if, Ms. Sheets, if you would just speak to that item, because that is really important that we have a solid understanding in terms of how we're treating agenda items before this commission.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sure, would be happy to explain that. Ex parte communication applies to any land use matter that is before the Planning and Zoning Commission as well as the City Council. And what that means, and there was a clarification with a court case at the Iowa Supreme Court that happened a little bit over 10 years ago that we try to remind the Commission and the City Council about from time to time. And what that means is that, based on that ruling, is that the discussions about a case, about a land use matter, need to happen in the public realm at a meeting like this, not one-on-one or two with two or that type of thing outside of the meeting, because at the meeting, then everybody can hear every part of what is said, and it truly is public and it truly is transparent. So it protects not only the property owners that are around there that want to express any concerns that they have or requests about the item that's in front of them, it also protects the developer, as we've had a commissioner mention about the land use rights that they have based on the zoning district that they're in. So all that discussion happens at the table with everybody being able to hear what was said, be able to respond to that and have a conversation rather than it happening behind the scenes somehow. So that's the point of ex parte, is the transparency and a discussion. In terms of notification, I wouldn't mind talking about that just a little bit too. We are required to notify in the case of a rezoning for every property that's within 300 feet of the particular parcel that's being considered for rezoning. And then that item, that notification happens before the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting as well as before City Council. And that simply gives the neighbors an opportunity to know about what's happening because they may not be watching every agenda or what's happening in the paper. So that direct notification happens in the case of a rezoning because then it does set forth what land uses would be permitted provided that the conditions of the ordinance are met then. So that's the reason for that notification. Now, about 9 months ago or so, the city started sending a courtesy notification for any land use matter that might be happening, required or not. So we are trying to make a better effort again at that communication and the transparency about a case coming forward that we're letting the neighbors know. And we're generally using the 300-foot as the area that we would notify for a site plan, for a land use amendment, in any action that's coming before the Planning and Zoning Commission. We're doing that. If it might have a lengthier process, sometimes Planning and Zoning Commission doesn't vote that forward. There might be more discussions. It might get tabled. We then try to make the effort to let the neighbors know when it's moving forward to council too. Many of our items do move through pretty smoothly of a discussion meeting with Planning and Zoning Commission, then a second meeting on recommendation, and then it moves on to council right after that. We're not going to do notification at every step in the process. We're usually looking to do that right at the beginning, unless the process might be either interrupted or a little bit lengthier, or whether it might be a little bit more controversial. So in the case of both Fairway and Quickstar, for example, we did do notification throughout that time of when it was coming forward to council meetings, because sometimes there was a lag there because there were issues that were trying to be addressed. And then, just then the last thing on zoning ordinance, the commissioners probably want to remind me, so I'll just come forward with it. When we talked about our capital improvement plan in January and had the meeting with the city council, we talked about the zoning ordinance overhaul, I call it, of just revamping the entire ordinance, looking at it, and that has been in our CIP for a number of years. We talked about how some staffing changes have impacted that, and I had a couple of commissioners asking, are we going to get that started this year? So yes, we are now gearing up to get that started and do some maybe outreach about different ways that you can think about zoning, what other communities are doing before we hire a consultant and get into anything.
I just wanted to reiterate the 300-foot rule, because I think some people feel that they are closer to a rezoning project than the 300 feet, and so they're expecting a notification.
Yeah, the 300 feet's not that much.
No, 300 feet is not.
But in the past, I think the planning department has gone beyond the 300 feet.
We did then, actually in the case of Fairway and Quickstar, had a request from a neighbor who did receive notice, who we've always known has kind of been interested in this. He asked that we let more people know, and we did expand that. So we actually notified, how many did we mail to, David? Total number? 400 people received notification multiple times about that land use matter.
Okay. Thank you.
I just want to note, failed to note this before, one of the other ways that, of course, citizens can participate with the commission if you're not able to attend a public meeting is to provide correspondence either through city staff, via email, letters. Those are shared then with all the commission members. So I want to note, enter into the public record that, for instance, the commission this evening has received an email and 2 letters from the Ball, Kirk, and Holmes attorneys at law and Brian Sires, as well as before each of the commission members is a response from the City of Cedar Falls. So note those are entered into the public record and before all the commission members as well. I want to give an opportunity if there's anyone else here for any general public comments. Okay. At this point, then, we'll move on to...
And I missed the beginning of the meeting. I'm assuming we're here on the zoning ordinance changes, C3 overlay. We're not there yet? Okay.
So our next agenda item is a public hearing regarding the zoning ordinance amendment. And Mr. Sturch, if you would please introduce this item for us.
I'd like to open the public hearing on this since it was published in the paper last week. So thank you, Mrs. Oberly. Just want to go over some slides, kind of refresh the commission's memory. We had discussion on this last month with some possible ordinance changes in the C3 district as well as College Hill and the downtown overlay district, and that kind of talked about use questions and parking related questions. But basically I pulled these goals out of the comprehensive plan and just want to go through some of those, just kind of promote these districts for commercial uses. The primary use, I guess, is commercial in those C3 districts, so we want to preserve those areas. And then along with that, promote those mixed use developments, and that could be office commercial or office retail restaurant, and then throw some of that residential use in those type of buildings. Again, maintain those street level commercial uses, and then include those variety of uses, housing types. When you're downtown, you want to have those residential uses, near those civic activities and commercial zones. So we want to maintain that, build on that, and create those walkable neighborhoods. You live downtown, you live in the College Hill area, you can walk to those service areas and nearby places. So again, keep creating that pedestrian-friendly environment. Again, we talked about in past cases over the last few years, what are those mixed-use buildings? Well, I think you can classify any building downtown or College Hill as a mixed use. You got your main use commercial on the main floor. You might have office on the second floor, or apartments on the second floor. So that is the mixed use concept. Again, just looking at some general definitions that are in our ordinance. The principal use is the main use of the structure, main use of the land. And again, that's accessory or secondary use is incidental to that principal use. So that's kind of the interpretations we've used on these past cases where it involved multi-story buildings, the State Street development, 201st Street, to mention a few. I think of the Domino's building up there in the College Hill were some of those cases that we looked at, and we used these type of definitions. So moving along from the building use to a parking classifications and specifications. Basically, we kind of have a gray area between the district, the C3 district, the downtown, the College Hill overlay districts that we kind of want to clean up with that. And they're conflicting provisions. We take the stricter standards that apply. That's typically what the zoning ordinance is. So again, with the College Hill overlay, that said that secondary use, if it's residential on the upper floor, that on-site parking isn't required, and no P&Z review is needed. Well, if it's a new development, we're going to have P&Z review in that. So we want to just kind of button that up, clean that up a little bit. And then in C3 district, again, that second upper floor residential use, the parking isn't required, but the council or the commission and the council can look at that to make sure or consider that secondary use if it is secondary to that principal permitted use. So again, we want to step back, take a look at these sections. Seem to be conflicts in there. We want to clear that up to develop a little clarity. Better for staff, better for the commission members to understand that, and moving along with the council members and as well as the staff, the public and developers as they want to put together a plan to present to the commission. Moving along with mixed-use buildings and the parking standards, when I say urban setting, I'm talking about the overlays of downtown and College Hill, the core of the area, in the middle of the city, and those are the areas we want to promote that pedestrian-friendly walkability environment. The location criteria kind of hit a little bit on that. That could be more of the location of the parking lots. We really want to keep that commercial use up to the sidewalk for that pedestrian scale, so to speak. We don't want to have any interruptions as we walk down the sidewalk. So keeping those commercial uses along the sidewalks. When you move into parking standards, they're there to address that parking demand. The generators are your commercial and residential uses. Those commercial uses, they're kind of temporary, maybe shorter term, that are intended for on-street parking or maybe public lot parking, parking lots for that. With a residential use, they're more longer term, maybe overnight parking. So the turnover is a little bit longer on that. So we want to kind of take all those ideas to encourage development and kind of set some standards to make sure they basically work in tandem. And when I mention that parking is not free, it's a cost for development. You got valuable land in these areas, and do we want to eat it up with commercial parking lots? So these are all things we want to take a look at when we're looking at these code changes. Just a quick survey of different cities, kind of similar sizes, a little bit bigger, college towns, Iowa City, Ames, and then a couple other cities in the state. But if you look at that table, they kind of limit the number of bedrooms, but then they have their ratios of 1 stall per unit for 1 bed or studio units. They're kind of similar, so that's a thing that the staff really wants to research a little bit more on the number of stalls per unit, but you can look at it both ways. If you call it per unit, you got to limit the number of beds, or you can apply it to number of beds. So those are elements we want to take a look at, and we want some feedback from the commission on those ideas. Just looking at public outreach, again, we introduced this in January, met with Community Main Street and College Hill Partnership, and again, we developed those languages as presented in last Plain Zoning Commission, the definitions section of a mixed-use building, the efficiency studio, looking at the commercial districts. Again, commercial on the main floor, residential on the top, parking in the back, and that would apply to the overlay districts of College Hill and the downtown. Also, we want to look at those exception clauses with existing buildings and what you can do for those upper floor developments. At the last March 28th P&Z Commission, there were some good comments and good discussions on those elements. The efficiency unit as compared to a 1-bedroom unit. What is the difference? That's something we want to kind of button up on that. And then we want to continue that discussion and develop those comments from the public and the commission. So just questions to consider, I guess, tonight, and we want to talk about is what are the appropriate parking standards for the C3 district? Is the College Hill and downtown, are they different? Should they have different standards? You look at ways to calculate those parking standards, and we want to simplify those standards. Is downtown, is there a different parking ratio? There might be, the occupancy might be different. There could be maybe one occupant in a 2-bedroom unit as opposed to the College Hill, two or three occupants in that same 2-bedroom unit. So again, there might be a difference in that area. And I kind of mentioned that in this next one, the parking lot calculation. Do we look at the building as a whole and apply a certain standard per bedroom as opposed to a certain standard per unit, like 1 stall per unit for 1 or 2 or 3 and so on. So that kind of limits how many units you can do on a lot, but still have that parking. And then again, look at those visitor requirements. They're kind of a shared use. Moving back to what I said before, is a commercial has that kind of shorter term use during the day, and the visitor is maybe during the night, so that could be a shared concept with, when the visitor is gone, that would be used for commercial parking. If you remember the discussion for 200 First Street, they had extra visitor parking stalls. They may not be used during the day for those visitors, but those retail tenants could use those stalls. So those are ideas that we want to continue that discussion. So again, having that discussion tonight with Plain Zoning Commission, want to hear your thoughts and ideas. Do some additional research on best practices and get some public input on these ideas. So with that, we'd recommend that we have the public hearing and hear what the comments are tonight, and then close that, and then table this matter for further information. gather more information.
Just a little bit of housekeeping. As Mr. Sturch said, the public notice for this hearing was published on April 4th. We need a motion and a second to receive and file that public notice. Is there a motion?
So moved.
A second? All those in favor signify with aye.
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 Opposed? Thank you. At this point, then, we declare the public hearing open and would invite anyone who'd like to speak to this item to please come forward.
Ishan Vajpayee, 3831 Conveyor Lane, Cedar Falls, here on behalf of my client, Brian Sires, and myself personally. Before I get into some of the meat of what I want to talk about, I addressed this in the letter, but one thing that I'd like to know, maybe a little bit more from staff, as to why certain parts of this major code ordinance overhaul are taking place now, and if these are eventually going to be run through a consultant, because that's what I heard, is that it's a multi-year process. Want to start thinking about how the ordinances are going to change for land use, get a consultant together, and move forward. But then these C3 overlay districts are being brought forward now, and I'm unclear as to whether or not these are going through the same process that other zoning district ordinance changes are going to be put through, and I would think that they should be put through the same process, especially since these overlay districts are clearly sensitive areas, and that's why they are overlay districts, subject to more strict, at least now, zoning requirements than the general districts in which they sit. One thing I saw up on the board was some parking ratios, spots per bedroom, spots per efficiency, spots per studio. And I think, I'd love to be wrong, but for the studios efficiencies, the second to lowest one, most of them had 1.5 or 2 or 1. Iowa City had 0.5. And I guess all I want to say is that I'm sure we've all been to Iowa City, and I don't know if everyone in this city or on this commission wants Cedar Falls to be Iowa City in terms of parking. And additionally, even as bad as it is in Iowa City, since I went there to school for 8 years, I can picture 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 4 high-rise parking ramps they have down there. So that's a big difference. And so that's something to really take into consideration when you're talking about decreasing parking requirements in this city. It's great to have density. It's great to not waste valuable land on parking. But do we have the infrastructure downtown Cedar Falls and on the hill to absorb possible overflow? Anecdotally, I think we all go downtown plenty to know that it's pretty tough to get a spot downtown now. Every proposal that I heard about revisiting this parking requirement, revisiting this parking requirement, revisiting this parking requirement is bringing the parking requirements down, adding more units to downtown, adding more units to the hill, and not requiring the parking ratios that this town has historically required. And this town has historically required them because parking has always been a very large concern. And when everyone was very animated about the single-family home conversion conversation, I remember that being a big element of it too. Parking, kids have parties, their friends come over, but then we want to revisit the visitor parking requirements. Something to think about. I was on the Hill for the College Hill Partnership meeting on Monday. Not a very busy night. Still had kind of a hard time finding a spot now. So I don't want to belabor what's already in my letter, but I think there's some parts of the ordinance changes being proposed that do make some sense, and some that are somewhat unnecessary when you think about what the code actually already allows. Okay, so putting in a definition for efficiency studio, good clarity. My client and I would think that maybe instead of 600 square feet, they'd be limited to 500 square feet. It reduces the possibility of, college students or younger people having too much room to get too many people in a quote-unquote studio. 500 square feet in, experience would be more likely to limit that occupancy to 2 people as opposed to, a couple sleeping in the studio and a friend sleeping in a hide-a-bed in the living room if it's too big of a unit. At that square feet ratio, it certainly would make sense that these are going to be lower occupancy units than a 1-bedroom. And so maybe there is some wisdom in requiring less than the 2 stalls currently for that kind of unit. As I talked about earlier, I don't think it makes sense to try and slide down to that 0.5 or that 1 as is currently proposed. 1.5 might be a better consideration for studio units. And as I stated before, I think a studio unit should still count as a unit in the visitor parking calculation, which really isn't very onerous. If you do the math on it, on a really big development, it's not really that many spaces when you think about it, so I don't necessarily see why it should be scrapped altogether because people certainly do have visitors. If the commission, if the city, if this town is going to err on the side of, well, should we risk having too little parking or should we risk maybe having a few excess spots? I think that answer is self-evident. We should err on the side of having a few more spots, maybe making the developer of a large project have possibly a few more spots than they would absolutely need. Because if we err on the other side and it is a parking shortage, then at what point in time are we back here 5 years from now and we say, we need a parking ramp on that corner? And who pays for that? Is the developer going to come back and pay for that because their building created the problem or played a role in the problem, to be fair? So that's that on the parking issue. This addition of the mixed-use building definition, I'm not sure exactly if it's just to add a mixed-use definition to clarify what commercial with residential on top of it means. To add that additional definition, I think that'd be one thing, but I would caution against using that mixed-use definition to pull a certain class of buildings out from the requirements of the code as it stands. We want to develop commercial with residential on top in the C3 districts and the overlay districts. That's possible right now under this current code. We know it is. State Street, Domino's, Sidecar, Urban Flats. That's possible under the current code. I would caution against getting back into this idea that we're going to say a mixed-use building is commercial on the ground floor and however much you want to build residential on top, and then somehow exempting out mixed-use buildings from parking requirements. Because as certain site plans have come before the commission and the council, it's been repeated. Well, under city's definition, staff's definition of these buildings, this building doesn't need any parking. And is that really what should happen? Should you be able to build a commercial or a building with 64% commercial on the bottom floor or even 100% commercial on the bottom floor, stack 90 units on top of it and not have any parking? So I would caution against using this mixed-use definition to legitimize that and allow that, because I think we all could see far down the road how big of a disaster that could be. Density, same thing. Density requirements need to be, if this mixed-use definition does come into play, parking requirements need to be applied to it. Density requirements need to be applied to it. You can build, you can get a good density bonus under the current code, allowing for pretty big developments. So that's just something to keep in mind and to keep an eye on. And then I do recall there being a provision for planning and zoning possibly having a role in considering case-by-case basis, private off-site parking agreements for certain developments. And I'd really caution against that, one, because I personally believe that that usurps the role of the Board of Adjustment. If a certain development needs a variance from a parking requirement in the ordinance, they can go to the Board of Adjustment, and that's really where they should go. Planning and zoning doesn't need any role in considering some private off-site parking agreement. And I think that is it creates a whole nother problem where you have maybe an agreement between a developer and their tenants to say, well, promise not to park back here, okay? And then they do. And then who's caught, again, holding the bag? We've been told the developers need guidance. They have it. It's in the code right now. As I stated, these mixed-use commercial with residential on top, it's possible under the current code. It doesn't need to be majorly rewritten, and I'm not saying that that is what is going to happen because it's still in the early stages, but that's something to keep an eye on, that these mixed-use buildings really need to be held to similar standards as they are now, maybe a little adjustment on the parking, but just because the ordinance doesn't allow a certain development to go through with a certain amount of units and a certain amount of floors doesn't mean that the code should change. Maybe a development lops a floor off. Maybe instead of 80 units, it's 60 units. Maybe the developer doesn't get to build exactly the building they want, but that seems fine. That seems a better option than rewriting the code to meet a particular development or a particular vision for future developments. So, thank you.
Anyone else who would like to speak to the item? Please state your name and address for the record.
Dennis Bigelow, 3909 Beaver Ridge Circle, Cedar Falls. I've had an opportunity to talk to quite a few individuals that are in business, and I talked about commercial business on College Hill, and I said, what would be a requirement for you to open a branch office or to open a business up there? And one of the main requirements is accessibility. You know, if there isn't a place, a way for the customer to access the business, then it doesn't make sense to open a business up there. And quite frankly, and we're coming off a pretty terrible winter in my view, you know, if you've got a shoe store, a clothing store, some other commercial business, and it's February, and you've got to park 4 blocks away or 5 blocks away, that's not a very good decision or good opportunity. And then the other thing, I've talked to a couple people that are investment bankers and so forth who have said, you know, if I had an opportunity to build a building, get it approved in an area where I would have college students as residents, and I could put 10 stories above a commercial 1-story, I wouldn't care if I filled the 1-story or the 1-level commercial, because my revenue stream is from everything above. And you think about that, and you know, when it has been reiterated and reiterated, when the main use of a building defines its principal use, that's what your code says. That has worked in the past. It should work going forward. And it you know, for the perspective of an investor or somebody that's going to conduct business up there, they're going to want accessibility to their business, and they're going to want, you know, the convenience of the people being able to get there. And when the last proposal was such, I don't think they care if that commercial part was ever filled, because that's not where the revenue stream's coming from. That's my thoughts and observations. Thanks for your time.
Hi, Carol Lilly, Community Main Street, 206 Main Street in downtown Cedar Falls. First of all, I would like to applaud you for taking a look at this issue. I think it's important. It seems to come up over and over and over again on occasion, so I applaud you for taking a look at this now rather than waiting, because it's just going to continue to be a discussion point. So thank you for that, and thank you for city staff for reaching out to our organization to be involved in the process. And I think that we have really tried hard to gather information and provide it to city staff. I don't think we're done yet. We're still working on that. We actually have a strategic planning session scheduled for next week, and with our board and other members of the community. It will be facilitated by an outside facilitator through Main Street, Iowa. And we're not talking about our organization, we're talking about downtown and our vision for downtown. And we would like an opportunity to continue that discussion and provide further input as we get more information. I think that there does need to be clarity in the code and an understanding and interpretation of that, because our understanding is that there is no parking requirement with the C3. So if interpreted in that way, this is an improvement of what's under discussion, and requiring some parking with that residential piece going forward, I think, is something that really needs to be discussed, and figuring out that ratio and those definitions definitely need to happen, and I appreciate the opportunity to provide, again, input into that discussion. As I said, we are going to be having our strategic planning session. This is going to be something that is on our agenda to look at what is being discussed, and then determining how do we want to move forward as an organization to help create what we think is going to be best for downtown. I don't venture to speak for anything but downtown, because that's not my or our organization's area of expertise or knowledge base. So I can't speak beyond that, how our C3 district fits in with the rest of the community. And then the other thing that I would like to say is that historically, residential is a component of commercial and residential on top. That's an important part of downtown. We do have commercial and residential in our downtown area, and that's something that we want to keep that moving forward as well. So that would be our position at this point. Thank you for allowing us to continue to be part of the discussion, and I think we're moving in the right direction. I just don't think we're there yet, and I appreciate that you're taking the time to make sure that we get it right.
Anyone else? Commission, questions, discussion for staff?
I guess I'd like to clarify for the public that this commission is not trying to legitimize some project. The current zoning requirements are set up based on a classic Main Street commercial with one story of residential above it. We are seeing in this community a level of density that is different, and we're trying to address those issues to clarify it, so we're not guessing on every project that we do. It's a different thing, so we talk about history. This is a different level of development that we're seeing, and we're trying to address those head on in terms of what we should be doing long term.
I would like to clarify, one of our constituents sent a text to one of our council members saying that I was upset about the parking. I just wanted to say the word is concerned, not upset. And it was in discussion of the downtown district. As far as I do have to say, I'm on the board of the Community Main Street Downtown District, so it was in that context. I agree with some of the comments made earlier that one size doesn't fit all, and that maybe College Hill District is a little different than our downtown district. And I'm thankful that we are going to be exploring this further, and I am looking forward to the strategic planning meeting, because one of the things that concerns me is, as a regulatory body, if we're only looking at regulations and requirements without considering possible future consequences to the vibrancy and the mix that we have down there, I think that's very important that we look at it all. And so it's important to get city staff, developers, retail business owners, property owners, people who shop downtown, people who live downtown in talking about what this might look like and how it might affect the downtown that we currently have and how we want it to go forward. So, and then I'm glad that we're moving this forward, but I also am glad that we're going to take some time and look at it all. So I'd encourage you to not just look at parking requirements and what other cities are doing, but what do we want to be? What are we going to be like? What is Cedar Falls? We're unique, all right? We are unique. And I don't want to be in Iowa City, honestly, but that's my opinion.
Couple comments, I guess. Having C3 and having different regulations between downtown and College Hill is not desirable in my mind. I mean, I'm not saying I'm opposed to it. You know, I understand why there might be some thinking along those lines, but just from a purely kind of regulatory standpoint, and actually somebody who deals with codes every day, the more variations you put in and all those types of things, it just makes it more difficult and makes it more apt to end up having some other problems along the way. So, you know, my preference would be if we can come up with a solution that, you know, works across the whole C3 and is uniform. Just that's my preference on that end. One of the other things that I was thinking about is looking at these ratios as we try to study that to determine how to determine the number of parking stalls that are required. In looking at the studio apartments, I agree with the discussion earlier that maybe that 600 square feet is too large, especially if you're looking at, you know, we were looking at two, in the one scenario, we're looking at 2 parking stalls for a 1-bedroom and 1 parking stall for a studio, which, you know, 1 stall for a studio seems like a reasonable, just off the top of my head, but then, you know, 2 stalls for a 1-bedroom, that's, you know, twice as many, right? And you get to 600 square feet, I just worry that, you know, you're going to get quasi 1-bedrooms that people are going to be arguing about calling them studios. You know, you can put a partial wall in, you're going to stop at a foot from the ceiling, and now it's a studio and not a 1-bedroom. Yeah, I could see some difficulties there. So I think looking a little closer, maybe reducing that square footage might make sense, because 600 is easy a 1-bedroom. You know, somebody can make a 1-bedroom with 600 square feet. But I think what you're talking about, doing more research on kind of how people are measuring the number of parking stalls, there's a lot of variations in there. So I do think we need to take some more time to digest that. And so anything you can turn up on that will be great.
Seems to me like it'd be a lot clearer if you just went by unit. A lot of those towns on there were going by unit and requiring even fractions of car or stalls per unit.
Yeah.
Figuring out what that unit or that stall per unit number is.
But then to David's point, you're going to end up kind of probably regulating the number of bedrooms in a unit, because, you know, right now we can have like 4.
Sure.
You know, so you know, if you're doing a bunch of 1-bedrooms and then the next guy's coming in and doing all these 4-bedrooms.
Sure.
It's ultimately about beds.
Yeah, right.
Beds equals cars.
Yeah, I think that seems to be the best measure, but.
So I again want to ask the question about the principal use, because we've had this discussion several times. Principal use of land or structure. And I know that we talked about it's the first floor, and then above it is Katie barred the door. Not necessarily, but you know what I mean. So when I look at a primary use or principal use of a structure, I look at what it is, where's the revenue stream coming from? And so I guess I would like some more discussion about that. If we're going to say that it's a commercial building and then you can have so many bedrooms, but the principal use is commercial, I have trouble with that.
So I could probably provide some clarity here. So the reason that we were trying to move away from having the parking based on principal and secondary use, and just creating a definition that a mixed-use building, all the uses in the building are principal uses.
Okay.
So that, because right now, it seems like the confusion about the parking requirements is this notion that something is secondary, and something's principal. Whereas all the uses in the building are creating some sort of parking demand. And so that seems to be the real confusion about how do you calculate the parking when there's this sort of gray area about sometimes requiring parking for upper floor uses and sometimes not requiring parking. And I think it creates confusion both for the public, for the policymakers, for the decision makers, and also for the developers as well. So I think that's the whole crux of what we're trying to do with the changes to the parking requirements, is to get rid of that gray area, get rid of the distinction between principal and secondary uses in a mixed-use building, and really kind of zero in on what is the parking demand that's generated from these types of buildings in an urban setting versus a suburban type setting where the parking demand would be different. So I think that's really what we're trying to clarify with this.
So make the parking requirement based on use, no matter whether it's principal or secondary.
Or clarify that when parking requirements are required, because right now, there seems to be some confusion that the standards right now are that if it's secondary in the C3 districts, it's not, parking is not required, and that's where we ran into this issue with.
Well, and just in terms of consistency, it's not related, totally related. You look at the building code, if you have a 5-story building, 1 story is commercial and the other 4 are apartments, the principal use is residential by the building code. And so if we have, then over here our ordinance, and we're going to call that principal use commercial, because I'd rather say, let's have some consistency across and say the principal use is residential, and then the parking requirements are, based on the use, type. So 'cause it seems odd to me that we got a city, and depending on what department you go talk to, in one case the building's considered commercial, and the other one is considered residential. So I just like to see consistency across that, because my mind has a hard time keeping it all straight otherwise.
I would agree with Marty's comment earlier about the consistency between the Hill and Main Street. I think we don't want to, if we set up differences there, we're going to encourage development in one over the other potentially. And I think they're close enough that maybe we don't want to get into that.
The one question I have is in regards to the comment before with going forward with a consultant and reviewing all of our ordinances. Are we going to review this again when we hire a consultant? Is this something that's going to be, we're potentially changing now and then would be changing again in a year or so after we hire a consultant? I just am confused about that process.
So I can probably answer that. I think the larger project, I think the reason that we're talking about this now is because there was so much confusion and the ordinance isn't particularly clear. And so it seemed like it was something that needed to be addressed sooner rather than to wait for, a larger zoning ordinance overhaul is going to take quite a bit of time and discussion. And I think then all those questions are up for debate at that time as well. So we can reopen the discussion about parking standards in general for the larger zoning code overhaul. I think that's appropriate to be looking at all those types of questions with an overhaul. But if we wanted to address this because we feel like there's going to be more of these types of developments coming in through the pipeline prior to getting to that final resolution in the larger overhaul, I guess the question is for the commission and the council, is it important to try to address this sort of gray area now versus waiting for the larger larger discussion. So if it's not an emergency and we don't need to address it, we can kick it into the larger overhaul, and it will be discussed at that time as well. So I guess, from what I understand, this was brought up because it was a concern right now. So it's up for your discussion, but.
My opinion is we should do something now, just because there seems to be such a gray area and there's a hole in, and that just leads to potential abuse in my mind. So I think we should do something now, and then when the whole code gets revised, maybe it'll be changed then. But that's the whole idea of having a whole brand new code, is to really bring everything up together. So that's my opinion.
Yeah, we've had a series of projects over the last 9 to 12 months that, this hasn't been just one situation, of course. It's been a series of projects where we've encountered this. So I'm supportive of us handling this now.
And I think it's good for clarification for developers as they're planning projects and coming before city staff. It helps city staff then too, and us in going forward. So I would agree that this probably should move forward.
What are we looking at for, have you penciled out a timeline for actually getting a new ordinance in place? It's beyond a year, right, before we could ever practically have a new zoning ordinance in place, and it might be several years, I'm guessing.
Yeah, you're probably right on track there with it. Would take several years. I think there's a lot of public outreach that needs to occur, because when you're talking about the entire ordinance and a lot of different things, from parking to land use to, just the zoning pattern in general. And, there's a lot of education that goes along with that. There's a lot of public discussion that has to occur. And not only that, but we want to take the time to find the right consultant to help us with that process. So we need to get the consultant on board, and then we need to, go through that process carefully so that there's time for the kind of public outreach and discussion that's needed for that type of overhaul.
And a good point to say encouragement and appreciation for Community Main Street's effort to do that strategic planning in that area, and looking at, Carol's talking about them looking at their vision for downtown. All of that is really, really important. Figure out those pieces.
Carol Lilly again. Yeah, that's exactly it. We really want to see what the vision is for downtown. What do we want downtown to be? And then how does the ordinance fit in to make that happen? And what can we do? Do we want, 8, 9, 10-story buildings? If so, let's make sure that we can make that happen. I don't think anybody wants that, but I'm just saying, we need to look at really what do we want to be when we grow up? Do we want 3-story buildings? Do we want to, kind of recognize what's here and reflect that going forward? So how do we use the code to make sure that our vision comes to reality? Mm-hmm. And whatever that vision may be, we need to make sure that we're all, getting that input and we're all on the same page, and then we can work in that direction. We can't work in that direction until we really have a better picture of where we want to go.
And I would encourage, too, if the College Hill area can do something similar, that is ideal. It's 2 different areas, 2 different groups and citizens and businesses operating in those areas, but a similar activity in that area would be really useful also, I think. Any other comments or questions? Or Mr. Sturch, any remaining items for us to address?
No, I appreciate the comments tonight, and staff will keep looking at the research and looking at kind of some new planning practices, and meet with with developers, owners, downtown College Hill, and try to keep the process going and getting back to you here pretty soon.
Do we need to make an official motion to table it, to continue the?
Go ahead and close the public hearing first on this item, and take a motion.
So moved to table the.
Is there a second?
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Those in favor of tabling this item signify with aye.
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 Opposed, nay. Okay, thank you. We move on. We have one item of old business. This is a zoning ordinance discussion as well. This is a central business district overlay amendments. And Ms. Lehman, if you would give us the background information on this one.
Yes, thank you. And actually, Carol Lily's comments about the vision of downtown and how it basically manifests as it grows is kind of a good segue. So this is really kind of that same discussion, really, in terms of the design, the type of buildings we want to see going in the downtown district. So as you know, Community Main Street and city staff have been working very closely. It's been probably about a year and a half now, 2 years, trying to figure out how we would like to see design and buildings develop in the overlay. And so before we drafted any code, we wanted to get initial reactions and discussion from the commission. So if you remember back in January, we presented the general kind of thoughts and directions, and the commission gave us some feedback. So it's been a little bit, but we've taken that feedback, and we have a drafted text to look at. And really it's more so the ideas of the text to see if we're right in the direction you gave us, less so about the actual text, the wording in there. So today I'd like to walk through each of those points and get some feedback, and then what the next step would be taking that feedback and then really drilling down the code and getting that verbiage right. So at this time, again, not really the verbiage, but more the concepts I'd like to discuss. So just before I jump into those, just a quick overview. There really are two main points of this review of the downtown overlay district. And really it's to clarify the review process itself for new developments in the area, and then also looking at the applicability and threshold of the review criteria, the facade reviews that occur in the downtown. So the process for clarity, really two things in that area, and they're less detailed really in those two, but the main one being, I'll actually skip to B, is that Community Main Street's role in the design review process. So kind of over time, they kind of unofficially became an official member, kind of, in terms of their feedback. And they would like to not be an authority figure. They want to be more of a resource for their community, kind of seen as somebody to go to for advice. And so in that sense, they no longer wish to review the projects as they come up before they come to P&Z and provide feedback. So really in some ways, this change tries to capture kind of that lost expertise. Their design committee members is comprised of successful business owners of the downtown, architects, signage individuals, et cetera, and historians even. And their feedback has in many ways led to the success of the downtown as it is now. So really trying to take their expertise and take the types of insights they would give during their review and put it in the code for clarity. So that's one of the I guess the background kind of threads you'll see in the discussion. But then also really kind of just jumping back, just something that we'd like to consider since we're looking at the section is currently all new signage in the downtown, irrelevant of projecting or really those type of things, have to come through P&Z and City Council for review and approval. So a lot of times we have requirements in the code for square footage and distance and things like that. And usually there's very little, if no, discussion on those as they come through P&Z and Council. So to save time for both staff and the developer, we were playing with the idea of removing signage, projecting signage from that requirement of the design review process. So that's that A there of a potential amendment to not have to require that level of review for those type of improvements. So really the main point of discussion today is two. And I'll talk through each of these points individually after. And what I'd like it to be more of a discussion. So I'll stop after every kind of main thought and get some feedback. There's a lot of information coming up, so I didn't want to overwhelm you with too much at once. But really the three things we'd be looking at today is flexibility for new building setbacks, looking at the facade review specifically for new development. That's really what we're looking at. And then also, again, really adding more objectivity to the code so that for really many reasons that there's consistency from staff, from the Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council and the type of designs we look at, that we have a future vision of what type of growth we would like to see in the downtown overlay. And again, as I mentioned before, incorporating the expertise of that design committee of Community Main Street into our code so that their knowledge isn't lost and is consistent, so we can continue to see the type of high standard development and success that we've seen so far in the overlay. So with that, I'd like to jump into the first section really, and that is setbacks. So as it is right now, any new building, their setbacks have to follow the zoning standards, the zoning setback standards of that area they're in. So areas like the C1 and C2 zoning have 20-foot, 25-foot, 10-foot setbacks from the streets. But what you'll see is in a lot of the older districts, a lot of the buildings are actually built up right to the sidewalk. There's that walkability, that closeness to the street. And so what we'd like to propose is rather than a new building having to meet those setbacks, actually allow commercial, professional office, and service uses to build up to the distance, I guess, of the neighboring buildings, to be as close and as walkable as the surrounding buildings in the area. So that's the first amendment we'd like to discuss with you, as if that's something you'd like to see. Again, really, I have some verbiage on the screen of what that could look like. So basically, again, saying, you know, rather than having to meet that 20-foot, 15-foot setback in whatever district, you could basically, within the same block, line up with whatever building is closest to the sidewalk to have that consistency and that feel of, I guess, community, so it doesn't feel like a kind of out of sorts in that sense. So that's the first item I'd like your feedback on.
Yes.
So would that be a requirement that they match that, or?
No, it would be a minimum.
But they can do.
Minimum. So they could go that close, or they could go a little further out.
So, yeah, what you're saying is within the central business district, we got C3, but we also have C1 and C2 and maybe some R4 or whatever. But this would overlay that and just say that overrides the setbacks on any of the zoning underneath this overlay. So you can have zero setback.
More or less,
Yeah.
again, depending on the other buildings around them. But
Yeah.
right now, we're proposing this is only for the commercial, professional office and service building uses. So those aren't allowed in the R4 district, so they wouldn't apply to those areas.
So what buildings wouldn't be allowed to have the zero setback
So
in that
let's say
scenario?
somebody wanted to build, you know, depending on how they define primary use, let's say a residential building, that may not be allowed, a single-family home. Those are really the ones that may not be met, but generally you'll see, most of the buildings you'll see in these areas will be the commercial type of buildings.
I guess I would, if I'm going to do that, I'd make it for any building, because it's pretty hard to distinguish. I mean, what's a single-family home versus is it going to be an apartment building? You know, realistically, nobody's going to be building a single-family home in that district at this stage of its life.
Could happen.
Yeah, but, you know, it's a rare thing, but why would that one thing have to have a setback and nothing else then? You know, within the district. It would look odd.
So could I get a sense from the other commission members where you feel that way? Because that's definitely something we could do, is just say across the board, no matter what use, if you're in the overlay, you have these setbacks. Can I get a general sense of what your thoughts are on that to the other members?
Is there much residential in that overlay district at all?
And actually, my next point, I actually have a zoning map. I don't know if you can, ooh, it's a little small. But basically, yeah, Franklin is kind of the cutoff point, but most of the development is most of the areas are C1, C3, and there's some C2. There's a corner that's M2, thank you, and that's industrial, and there's a tiny little corner, R3 to the south. So really, most of the area, probably about 90–80%, would be that C1 through C2 zoning.
There are residential.
But there are some residential buildings that have been built there prior to 1970. So there are some residential uses within those areas.
I agree. I think this is a good idea. I think we want to be matching that existing.
For any building type of use.
Yeah, I can't say why it would need to be in
I agree.
separation.
I think it makes sense for any building.
So jumping into the next section, applicability. So this is really talking about more the applicability of the design standards, the facade standards. And what we're proposing is that these new design standards really focus on storefront type of buildings, narrowing down on the commercial strips, the walkable strips. So what we would like to propose is that basically of course, any new development, any substantial change would still have to come through P&Z and City Council for approval. But if it were the C1, C2, and C3 zoning district, then the following stricter review criteria will come into play. So that's the first thought. And the idea really being, M2, the M2 zoning district, the industrial district, where you have things like Viking Pump. It doesn't really make sense to have the same stringent, storefront commercial review criteria as it would be something a block off Main Street or on Main Street. So really that's that thought behind it, to kind of address the thought we had when you brought up the idea of districts, having different review criteria. But really in this way it would allow commercial growth to continue out into those areas and kind of follow that Main Street walkable example. That's a thought. And then again, what we would do is exempt residential uses containing less than 7 dwelling units. So those existing single-family homes, duplexes, they wouldn't have to go through any of the review process if they, let's say, want to reside their home or add a porch or something like that. We don't need to take them through the review process. So those are the two kind of applicability points we'd like to discuss. And then just for your reference, I actually asked our GIS analyst to tell us exactly how many of these homes would fall under the exempt category. And there are 40 single unit homes within the district, 7 2-unit conversions within the district, 1 4-unit conversion, and 2 5-unit conversions. So those would not have to go through the review process. Any thoughts on this approach?
What about the M2?
So the M2 and the R3, if you would get new development, they would still have to go through the design review process, but they wouldn't have to meet all the details that we have, but we would still have the power or the ability to say, hey, what you're proposing here isn't appropriate to neighboring buildings. It allow us to be more subjective in the review.
So perhaps it would be more clear once Iris goes through the next slides that the design standards that we're talking about really relate to storefront type buildings. And so they won't really fit a residential building or an industrial building. So the standards that we'd put into the code would be related to storefront type buildings. So that's why.
Well, the only reason I mentioned the residential, I understand, but the industrial, looking to the future, what is the future of that M2 district? I mean, in reality, if we're going to do it today, that would not be a industrial zone, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a legacy from many years ago, and the way things are developing. I mean, don't we look at that as becoming a commercial zone at some point?
And maybe we just have a standard for anything within the district. And if we have the exemption of the residential units, those 9 homes in R3, they would be exempt from any review anyway. But then the existing homes too would be fine. So maybe we do just have one standard.
Because right now, Viking Pump is the only industrial in that. I mean, that's it. And if they decide to leave for any reason in the future, that's not prime industrial development land. It's prime commercial land. I just wonder if there's, I don't know how you address it, but it seems like we want to go somehow lead towards that being, more integrated into the commercial part of downtown.
Maybe you can ask this question after you go through the standards so the commission can see what the standards that are being proposed are, and then you can think again about whether which buildings these standards should apply to, and it could be that that's the right answer. But it might provide a little more clarity for the commission if you go through what the standards are first.
We can definitely come back to this idea. So without further ado, we'll jump into kind of the code itself. So the facade review as it is right now has a number of categories that we review as staff. I have them here listed for you on the slide. They range from color to proportion to signage. And we really touch on almost every aspect of new building or existing building review. So what we're proposing is actually to rename one section, add a few sections, and then we actually reworked a few sections. The ones that are not in red or bold, we're leaving as is, so I will not talk about those today. And then signage, we did look at that, and we add a lot of definitions and a lot of kind of ideas of what we wanted to go, but due to time and just the amount of discussion we're having tonight, and then just not to fry you too much, we'll hold off on that discussion for another time. And really just at this time, put your hats on for buildings themselves. What type of buildings, does, the general structure, colors and such we'd look at. We can look at the details about what we'd want on those a little bit later. So the first topic is height. And really there are kind of two directions that we're toying with of going. One is just having standard minimum and maximums within the district. Right now we're thinking, from Main Street, from 1st to 6th Street, there'd be a minimum of 2 stories. We wouldn't want a single story anything really to be built on that area. Again, that minimum would only be on that section. There wouldn't be that minimum anywhere else. Maximum, we thought C3 zoning up to 4 stories, and then other areas of the district up to 3 stories. And then we thought we would add maybe a provision saying something like, you can go higher than 3 stories if it's part of an approved kind of master plan that covers more than 2 blocks. There's a kind of a vision of what that area will look like, so it's integrated and less kind of piecemeal. So that's one approach, one idea that we can go into. We can talk about the stories and everything else, but that's a potential direction that we could go. The other direction is to allow for more flexibility. I don't know if many of you have heard about the kind of like the step back in terms of facade design. So we could do something along the lines of saying, okay, hey, you can have up to 3 stories, and you can go higher than that as long as you have a 10-foot step back, minimum step back. And what that means, you can kind of see it in this picture, is that you have the 3 stories come up, and then the moment you hit 3 stories, you go higher, you have to push that building facade back. So from the street front, when you're walking, it still feels like a 3-story building. It doesn't have that presence as it would without that step back. And maybe even allow it, if it had the step back, to go up to 6, 7 stories if we wanted to kind of be respectful of the existing, heights of the downtown, and really maybe in that sense allow for more density. Just some different ideas to play with. And with that, I'll kind of stop and see what your initial thoughts are. Or if you need more explanation on either, I'd be happy to help. And then just for your reference, the 2 images here, one is, the one on the right is what the building would look like, same building. I think it's actually a 6-story building, 5-story building from the street level. So again, as you're walking, it looks like, a 3, 4-story building. But then, from further away, it's actually built to be much taller than that. But again, I'd like your feedback on if you like the idea of the step back, if you don't like the idea of the step back, what type of maximum heights, minimum heights you'd like to see if
Why are we concerned about the number of stories?
So
limiting it. Right now, C3, there's no limit, right?
there is, but it's very, very tall. I mean, there's some weird calculation.
160
feet or something like that.
Yeah.
It's almost no limit.
Yeah.
Right.
We're not going to get the Sears Tower.
And really, something like this is to add objectivity to the code. So right now, the C3, the height standard is just said, hey, it has to be proportional to and respectful of the neighboring buildings. But what does that mean? That's open to interpretation and can change depending on who you're talking to. So again, to really provide more clarity to the code in terms of direction, how we want to see it go, that's why we'd like to add an actual definition or more, I guess, more guidelines to what we'd like to see.
Well, and I think it comes down to, again, what is the vision for downtown? Do we want a single story here, 2-story here, and a 10-story here?
Right. Well, I just think, in city centers, I mean, you get some pretty tall buildings sometimes, right? So what are we citing there's a limit to what we want to the city center of Cedar Falls, or is that, and I don't know the answer. I don't know, I have a hard and fast opinion, but I mean, it just seems like, what is the rationale for doing that? And because
So for example, there's that vacant lot where like the Santa corner is.
Yep.
So could you, with no height limit, would you be okay with a 6-story building being built there with only 3- and 2-story around it. But that's a thing that could come up that without any strict guidelines could.
I think there are guidelines, and certainly the Main Street corridor itself is probably different than as you get off Main Street, in my opinion. 3 to 4 stories seems to me maybe to be too restrictive as we get off of Main Street. You know, if you look at, there's some great renderings of what this city used to look like. You know, there were 6 to 8-story buildings on the river at that time that were factories. And so I kind of agree with Marty. It seems as we get off of Main Street that there could be a different.
And that's another topic of conversation, actually, because, and again, just initial discussion tonight, and then what we're going to do is take your comments. It doesn't have to be finite, there can be disagreement, and then take it to the Community Main Street meeting as well and continue to work with them. So we're not in any way deciding anything tonight, again, just brainstorming really. But if you look at the zoning map, generally what you have is you have residential, and as you go to the downtown, you have the density kind of increase. So do you want that type of growth, or do you want, because what you're describing is kind of the 3, and then I guess what type of, you know, that's something else to consider about, okay, when you approach the residential, do you want to get more dense, or do you want density to be focused around the actual downtown core? Something to think about, but it's, again, that discussion.
Good question. I think the process that Main Street is going through hopefully will give some vision for that. To me, it can work both ways. But yeah, we're going to limit the amount of development downtown potentially. So let's be conscious about doing that if we're going to. I think the approach of Main Street in terms of creating a vision for what we want to do, and then adapting kind of what we want to see, how we make that happen makes sense to me, versus the other, let the zoning driving the development.
Okay. I agree. So with that, we'll still walk through the rest of them, but then basically what we'll do is we'll wait, again, most likely then to have the Community Main Street meeting and then see what the vision is, and then maybe tailor what we have here to match that more closely. But still for brainstorming, it's good to get feedback. Then we have a kind of a head start as we move forward. Okay, so the next one is building composition. And I have multiple points, and I'll stop at each one. I do have images kind of afterwards to kind of explain it. So really what we're thinking, and again, this is more kind of pulling into what we'd like to see downtown, is division of vertical bays. So generally what you see with longer buildings, you have kind of visual breaks in the building, bays, to make it seem smaller, make it seem less gargantuan. And generally in the Main Street block, the store frontages are generally between 20 and 40 feet. That's kind of that feel of, you know, before you have that break of the next thing. So what we're proposing is to keep that feel, that walkability, that, you know, the approachableness, to not have those gargantuan structures, is really to have those bays in there. And actually all the developments we've seen have already incorporated that in there, and I have an example for you. But just kind of articulating the code that, you know, one space shouldn't be more than, or should be between 20 and 40 feet. So that's kind of that idea, and they can be broken up in different ways, by patterns, by materials, by, you know, recessing from the street side or so. So that would be an idea of trying to get that feel of more the downtown area. Then really kind of, we had this discussion with the hotel, having clear distinction between base, middle, and top, having that articulated in the code that we want to see that type of architectural breakup in buildings. And really with this, taking a step further and saying, you know, if you do break that up, you know, those horizontal features, the things like cornices, should kind of line up with neighboring buildings, so you have that consistent feel of, you know, continuation. And then this next one's more of a kind of protection of commercial spaces, that if you do build a commercial space on the main floor, the inside of it, the height be 14 feet. And that way it doesn't limit the type of commercial buildings that you see, because around the country there's actually been cases where you've had mixed use buildings and they put commercial on the main floor with the intent of really the residential being the main thing, but because there's only 10 or, you know, whatever feet below, it wasn't usable commercial space. So in this way it kind of safeguards that if they do have mixed use, the main floor, the 14 feet accommodates commercial uses that would want something like that. And then just for a visual to talk about the first two, here's an example of kind of an existing stretch of Main Street and then the new kind of building there on the side. And really, when we talk about vertical bays, this is kind of that breakup, the feeling of separate kind of facades in some way. And then when you talk about kind of like the lineup, you see the different sides. But again, in terms of base, middle, and top, again, having that clear distinction of the type of stages of the building, and that they should be, lined up with the neighboring. So you see the windows kind of in the same line, or the cornices in the existing buildings kind of lining up to kind of create that continuity, that feeling of togetherness, really. So those are, I'll stop there. Those are some ideas in terms of trying to help promote consistency and type of downtown development. I'd just like to get your thoughts on those ideas, and I'll go back to the text for reference.
I like the idea about the minimum requirement on the commercial level. I think that's a smart move.
Height.
Yeah.
That makes sense. It seems.
And I like the building composition, the bays, and that sort of thing. It just gives it a nicer feel and a more interesting, it's more interesting. And curb appeal is huge for downtown,
The composition with a base, middle, and top, that one to me is, I like that concept. Because that's really very traditional. That's what the downtown is. But to your example, though, of the newer building, to me, that doesn't really meet that criteria.
It doesn't have a top.
It doesn't have a top. It's got a base in the middle.
Because when I looked at it, it was really, you have the base, which would be the storefronts themselves, the windows, the walk building, you have kind of like the offices or whatever above, and then you have that other strip. So again, kind of like by uses, it doesn't have to be by material, but I don't know. I looked at it having the three, but maybe you're right. In the future, we'd like to see
The three-part breakup, that's very, that's a really kind of a standard design approach to do things and things like that. But, I don't know. When I hear that, I kind of say, you're trying to say it's all got to be very traditional, which the newer buildings are not. Not that they're wrong. I'm not making a judgment on that, but I don't know. That one's going to be hard to apply, I think. I like it, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily fair. I don't know.
Is it, Brad, Marty, is it necessary?
I think there's some good goals there. I think just as long as we're not trying to replicate history here.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I think it's important to clarify what our intent is, because when that's done, it's done badly.
Right.
But generally, I agree with Marty. It's a good concept. Hard to legislate design.
Yeah.
You know it when you see it.
It's hard to legislate good taste, right?
Yeah.
Developers. Teasing.
Okay. And then what do you think about the 14-foot for the interior? Is that a good idea?
Good idea.
Mm-hmm.
So the next big one, discussion on windows and transparency. And actually, this one got surprisingly the most attention in some ways. So the first one I'd like to talk about is really where the windows should be concentrated. So before I jump into that, we had to define what facade and storefront meant, just to kind of break it up, the different areas of the building. So when you see storefront, that's the first floor. That's the actual shopping, kind of main strip. The facade is everything combined. So in the terms of the windows, and we were proposing 50% of the storefront area, again, that main area, be comprised of transparent windows or doors, and that allows views into the interior of the building. And then, of course, in cases of corner lots where you have the 50% wouldn't really work because you have your like appliances and your mechanics, maybe kitchen stuff in the back. You don't want windows in there. We would have the option for maybe an exception that lower percentages could be done, but for reasons, and they'd have to present that to us. And then that 50% is something that through research and collaboration with different architects, we've come to, and actually generally in downtown areas, that's the minimum. It's probably about 70% when you look at existing buildings. So 50 is actually on the lower end, but in that way it gives some flexibility in terms of, types of designs, modern looks and things like that. The next one would be, really the window area should be concentrated kind of where the walkable level. So between the 2 and 14 feet above the sidewalk, really, so that, if they don't cheat and try to put it all above and you can't actually look in and that type of thing. So again, trying to regulate, okay, if you have windows, it's mainly for the shoppers, for the people walking the street. It should be at eye level. So kind of just articulating that it should start no more than 3 foot and really be concentrated around that eye view area. And that, again, windows should be, if they're there, clear and transparent and have low reflectivity so that you can see in, That's the kind of the main point of having them there. And that although tinted windows are discouraged, if they are there, we would allow up to 10% roughly, kind of transparencies. And that way, again, making sure that they really are meant for that visibility, that transparency, that walkability of the district. I think that's all for this slide. I jump it. And then for upper floors, and this was really more of a concern of seeing all glass buildings being put in somewhere. I don't know if we're at that point yet, but having a maximum of upper floors having 75% window coverage to avoid an all glass building going, and that was something that they didn't want, the design committee didn't want to have there. And I'll stop there. That's half of the window ones. Yes, I know. Or if you want, I can go right into the other ones, but we can discuss these first if you'd like. Okay, maybe I'll jump ahead then, no immediate reaction. So
My first reaction is 50% might be low.
Would like that.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of the percentages, do you think those are fair? Those are on?
I'd like to see a higher percentage on the first level.
50 is low.
Yeah.
So that was us trying to, but if you think higher, we can definitely go 70. That's the general.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen other places as high as 70. Yes, okay. Okay. And then the upper floors of having no more than 75% window coverage. What are your thoughts on that? Make sense? Or too much? Too little?
Seems high, but
Or do you just want to put in the ordinance that, all glass? If that's the intent, might as well just go right to it.
Right.
Why is it that we don't want all glass?
It just would be a strike comparison to what's there now, and the having the ability to have, and we'll talk about materials in a second. I think that's 2 slides from now, but really, we really want to promote, kind of that consistency of seeing stone and brick and those type of materials in the area, to have that consistency, still allow for modern materials, but still have that kind of connecting fabric, really. So again, making sure that there's an opportunity to have, the type of materials we want in those buildings, not just glass buildings go in. But maybe because of that, that requirement won't be needed because we already have limits on what materials we can use, but we can look at that one more.
maybe there's some play here too with, if we, the other portion where we're talking about building height, then maybe using the step back. Maybe it'd be desirable on some of those upper levels of a taller building like that to have a higher glass component. That's pretty typical city building structure as well.
Okay. So jumping into the second part of the windows, really in this way protecting existing buildings downtown, saying that any existing windows now in the downtown overlay, again for commercial office uses, they can't be reduced or removed without planning and zoning and city council approval. And that's more of a safeguard to kind of protect the historical integrity of all the buildings in the area. So that would be that kind of safeguard in the code. And then it's becoming popular to have window film, or kind of like an image here of signage kind of plastered on windows. You can see out of, but you can't see in of, and they have designs on them. I have an example here from the inside and outside view. From the outside, it's a gorgeous flower, and the inside you can see out and people walking. But the idea being we don't necessarily want to encourage those types of things in a walkable downtown district. The point is to be able to see through the glass. So basically saying that if they do want any window film or perforated materials on those windows, they wouldn't count toward the other percentage we had. So they could have them, but they'd have to provide more transparency to kind of make up for it. So that was that idea. And then kind of jumping into, exceptions of, okay, well, these things might be hard to meet. Maybe the site is unique. Maybe the location makes it difficult to have, or it doesn't make sense to have a storefront on this location. It is a commercial use. There would be an option for that potential person to come forward and propose something new, but it would be on them to prove or to say why and provide an alternative plan that would meet the type of vision and standards that we have. So just again, kind of providing that flexibility in case something does happen or if there's a unique situation where it doesn't work. That's the end of the signage section, or the signage, sorry, the window transparency section. Any thoughts on these last two, really three potential criteria?
How do you film one? I mean, that you're saying to somebody, I mean, that can happen. I mean, you got a building and then somebody comes and puts.
Oh, there's different, so signage is a different thing. So, but sometimes people, it's built in some ways. Like they have like boards with holes and that kind of creates atmosphere and that type of thing. So there are some construction things that have been done to have those perforated materials. I chose a bad example, but to give the sense of that's what it meant by more materials that aren't really see-through. They are, but they're not. Like those wouldn't count.
I mean, you can buy all these window films, right? You can stick up there and you have whatever, and you can see out, like you said, but not seeing so well. But it seems like it's going to be really hard to regulate that because you can go out and just buy that stuff
And I think that's going to be kind of a matter of enforcement rather than the original design because the businesses move in and out and they have different ideas about how they want to. But the idea is that if you have a clear and transparent storefront requirement, if somebody, egregious, it does something to one of those downtown windows such that it really blocks the views into the interior, such that it detracts from then the character of the street, I think, we'd have to discuss about how we would enforce the fact that those were storefront windows that were required to be transparent, and, maybe they'd have to take the film off, or say if they were just plastered with posters, for example.
Yeah. I'm less concerned about that because it's a temporary thing. You're not removing the windows. The windows are still there. And when that place goes out of business, the next one's going to take it down anyways, right? So I don't. To me, that's a little. I understand. I mean, I understand the desire for that. But.
Well, I'm going to give you an example. There's a storefront downtown now. There's several of them that have very tinted windows.
Yeah. Well, the tinted windows is different than the.
But they could put a film. But they could put something like that in there, thinking it's a design element of their shop, and it inhibits. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Or their office or whatever, and then it inhibits the.
Important comment is that we can see in.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not an opaque front.
Opaque, yeah.
Signs do.
That's true.
Yeah, could you handle it in that way? Just address the transparency piece of it. Because if things are coming and going, like now it's this perforation, what will it be in the future? That would get at fogging glass or whatever else,
Seems like it could be part of the window section where you just said there's transparency without films or that prohibit transparency.
Any other comments on the window transparency section before I move into materials? Okay.
I think it makes sense to require P&Z City Council review and approval for the reduction and the removal.
Those are windows on a primary facade.
Okay, so moving into materials. Again, that consistency we were discussing, we'd like to see at least 50% of the facade, again, that's the entire structure, not just the storefront, the entire structure, be one of these following materials, and that the rear and sides of the building be 25% of that. And those are numbers that we did through research and things like that. But again, we would be looking at brick, stone, and terracotta. So that would be a requirement, so that there's that consistency of materials in the downtown. That said, again, 50% of the entire facade is not very much. When you look at, I know, we were thinking about putting this to a table to make it a little bit more reader-friendly, but I wanted to list out the materials for you to see. So we're thinking about having limited amounts too, again, breaking it down into, fiber cement, aluminum, metal, EFIS, having that up to 35% max of any one siding material. And then, things like concrete, precast concrete, having that basically limited to architectural elements such as window hoods and cornices. But again, trying to, create harmony and allow for modern uses, but still have that consistent feel of the downtown by materials. That's kind of the hope by these directions. I know it's a lot to take in there, but any initial reactions about brick, stone, and terracotta being kind of the main focuses in terms of the design elements, and then still allowing that flexibility for more modern, say, metal in design.
So make sure you coordinate that with your window percentages, because they're gonna work together, right?
Yeah. If you got 50% windows, then the whole thing has to be brick, because that's the other 50%, how we measure it.
50% window would be the storefront, and then 75% would be the entire thing. So they do work.
I'm just thinking about how you measure your brick, your base material. Because, what percent of your storefront is glass? You subtract that. It has to be clarified as to how you calculate that area. You subtract out the glass, and then what's left, there's that measure.
Well, they're talking about the whole facade if it's a 2 or 3 story building, right? Mm-hmm. But it could be a 1 story too, I guess.
Well, if it's a 2-story building and say 50%'s got to be brick, but 75% of your storefront is glass. Does that mean that everything else has to be brick? Or does it
Brick,
only half of what's left
or
over?
stone.
Well, I think, like you said, taking away, having that percentage, the glass percentage being taken away from that, everything else makes sense. You have that.
I think you got to do that in order to make it some way to figure it out.
One option is to get rid of the percentages and just say a primary use material is this, and maybe there's a little more freedom in that.
Yeah. Yeah, when you put the hard numbers to it,
Primary and secondary.
Yeah, I was going to say.
it gets complicated. And you can get to that point, it's like, oh, I've got a really nice design sitting here, but it's like, I'm 5% short on brick.
Add a cornice.
And again, just warning, it's the same type of discussion though. If you say primary use, or primary material, you have to, again, to avoid, we'd have to define what primary is. So we would potentially have to have a percentage if we go that route. But again, something to think about, that avoiding subjectivity, really. But we can definitely.
We can work on that.
I don't think it's going to be easy.
Color, our next one. Oh. So in the downtown, right now it's pretty big. And so, the idea being, we thought we could do so, existing buildings should be really mostly earth or neutral tones, nothing super bright or grabbing too much attention, but those colors are allowed. as accents to a building. So up to 50% of the facade roughly can be accents. And so I have an illustration here of Wilbo where they have the nice kind of gray-blue background, and then they use like yellow and light blue to make it pop. That would meet the requirement. So something like this would be possible with that. Again, allowing bright colors, but really using it more as a tool to accentuate the building. And really, signage is really where the advertisement of the building or the use inside of it should really be focused and not the actual structure itself. So just initial thought that we had in terms of kind of putting down the code, what we'd like to see in terms of color in the downtown. What are your thoughts on?
As long as you allow for some gray, I'm kind of tired of orange, red brick. No, I like the idea of the accent colors. And like I said, that adds interest, and those are appealing to shoppers and bringing people down here. It adds excitement and interest. So allowing the accent colors, I think is great.
Okay, last one. Building entry. We thought it would be a good idea to specify exactly what type of entryways we'd like to see. And actually, I'll just put them all on the screen so you can see them. But really trying to consistency just, for clarity and so that contractors know exactly what they're looking for. Entrances should be oriented toward the street. They should be, facing the main walkway. When you see storefronts that are longer than, let's say, 100 feet or more, they should have a number of entrances in so that it feels more like a walkable, accessible building. So playing with that, 40 or 20 to 40 feet, every 50 feet there should be an entrance into the building in some way for walkers to feel invited into it. That's something that we actually took from the Iowa City Code. I think the numbers were slightly different, but just an idea. And then really entryway should be at grade with public sidewalks, again, kind of meeting ADA standards. We don't want them on steps so everybody can access them. And then really, we want entryways to really be the prominent point of the design. It catches your eye, you know where to enter. That's kind of the vocal point of the building. If that's done by awnings or colors or some sort of, signage there, we would like to see, people put effort into making those entryways look inviting. So those are the entryway points we'd like to discuss with you about if you think those are appropriate or maybe getting too specific.
I would take out item 3. That's really covered in a lot more detail in the building code.
But we do have a lot of storefronts down there. They're not at grade level. So we do have to think about that.
But anything new, you're not going to be able to do that. You won't meet the building code, so.
Okay.
Seems redundant. I agree.
Well, you could technically do it. You would just need one ADA entrance. If your ADA entrance is in the back, you would meet building code. So in this way, it's saying that your main entrance on whatever street it is would be at grade, so anyone could access through that. You wouldn't have to go a roundabout way to get in. So technically, it does get specific, but maybe not specific enough.
I know that there's some communities where they didn't have the standard and there was lots of ramping going on. Somebody, said they wanted to put underground parking and then it pushed the building up, and they said, well, we're going to address our ADA by creating this ramping system. Well, they technically then would have an at grade, entrance to the building, but it really detracts from any kind of commercial activity on the ground level. I don't think there's much of that going on here, but as you get larger buildings that might pencil to do underground parking, that's when that kind of issue might come up.
But then you go back, you start putting that big ramp there, you're going to have a problem meeting the window requirement that you put in there, right?
And then you come into which is the ground level floor then, too. So it just helps clarify what really constitutes a storefront.
But I can imagine, a long storefront with 3 entrances with a 0 lot line. It's really tough to have one floor level sometimes. So it would restrict really to smaller footprint buildings probably.
Any other comments on the other 3 items? Okay.
I don't know where they went.
Well, with that, again, we'll talk about signage next time. It's a whole other beast. With that, I want to thank you for your time and your comments, and we'll take what you have and meet back with Community Main Street and put it back together and have something more final for the next time, hopefully. Maybe not the next meeting, but some meeting in the future. Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank
your work
you.
putting that together.
Yeah, thanks, Iris.
That concludes our old business items, and we have no new business items, so I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
A second?
Second.
All those in favor of adjournment signify with aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Thank you. We are adjourned.